At dawn on February 3, the British Crown made a move it had not made in living memory. 2 passports were frozen, not belonging to criminals, not belonging to fugitives, but belonging to 2 children born into one of the most scrutinized families on earth. The decision was executed quietly, without cameras, without press statements, and without warning. Inside royal systems, the action appeared as a procedural lock, a technical safeguard. But in constitutional terms, it signaled something far more severe. It meant the Crown had determined that the children's safety, identity, and continuity were at risk. And once that determination is made, there is no undoing it. For Prince Harry, this moment arrived after he believed the hardest chapter of his life had finally closed. A custody agreement had been signed. Lawyers had stepped back. The public tension surrounding his children appeared, at least on the surface, to be easing. There was talk of fragile peace, of parallel parenting, of moving forward quietly. But peace was an illusion. What followed that agreement did not bring stability. It triggered alarm. Behind palace walls, officials began noticing something deeply unsettling. It was not a public interview. It was not a legal threat. It was not even a direct accusation. It was absence, silence, a pattern of withdrawals that left no paper trail and no explanations. By the time the Crown acted, it was no longer reacting to a single decision. It was responding to a trajectory. Inside Windsor, a sealed legal notification had arrived just days earlier. Its contents did not read like scandal. They read like warning signals. Education links severed without notice. Medical appointments quietly canceled. Communication channels blocked. Institutions tasked with safeguarding children left without answers. What disturbed senior advisors most was not what was done, but how carefully it was done. Each step, viewed alone, could be explained away. A change in schooling, a scheduling issue, a legal adjustment. But taken together, they formed something unmistakable. Preparation. By the time PE and Prince William was briefed, the language had already shifted. This was no longer framed as a custody disagreement. It was described in far colder terms. Identity risk. Emotional displacement, potential eraser. At that point, the Crown stopped waiting. The decision to freeze the passports was not punitive. It was preventative. Under royal guardianship principles, once children are believed to be at risk of being removed from their historical and constitutional context, intervention becomes mandatory, not optional. No press release accompanied the action. No explanation was offered to the public. But internally, the message was stark. The Crown had crossed a line from observation to control. And then almost immediately a second shock followed. According to sources close to the situation, Prince Harry began making accusations that stunned even seasoned palace officials. Claims involving Meghan Markle. Claims involving Prince Andrew. Claims raised not during negotiations, not during mediation, but only after authority over the children had begun slipping beyond reach. Why speak then? Why wait until silence had already triggered the most severe response available to the monarchy? Those questions remain unanswered. What is clear is this. The freezing of 2 passports was not the beginning of the crisis. It was the confirmation that the crisis had already been unfolding for months. And what the Crown uncovered next would leave no room for compromise. The first alarm did not come from the palace. It came from a school. On January 31st, administrators at 2 private schools in Santa Barbara noticed something that immediately broke protocol. Archie and Lyra did not arrive for the new term. At first, it appeared ordinary. Children miss days. Families' travel schedules change. But by midday, concern set in. There had been no notice of withdrawal, no transfer request, no explanation submitted by a parent, a legal representative, or an educational liaison. More troubling still, the schools had not been informed of any replacement institution. There was no destination listed, no academic continuity plan, nothing. By policy, such absences triggered an internal review. Within hours, the situation escalated from routine absence to immediate concern. Staff attempted to contact Meghan Markle directly. Emails went unanswered. Calls were not returned. Messages left with administrative representatives produced no response. The schools then reached out to the court-appointed mediator overseeing the children's welfare under the custody agreement. That office too had no record of a change. At that moment, the issue crossed a threshold. When children vanish from an educational system without explanation and no guardian can be reached, it is no longer a private family matter. It becomes a safeguarding question. Alerts were issued. By that evening, the situation had reached officials connected to international child welfare monitoring, including the United Kingdom liaison team assigned to oversee the children's cross-jurisdictional protections. What they found only deepened the concern. There were no travel notifications on file, no updated residency declarations, no filings indicating relocation, homeschooling, or private tutoring. Even more unsettling, there were no newly registered medical providers connected to the children. When investigators checked pediatric records, the pattern became clearer. Multiple routine medical appointments had been cancelled in rapid succession, not postponed, not rescheduled, cancelled outright. No follow-up instructions were left. No continuity of care had been arranged to experienced child welfare professionals. This combination was alarming. Children had been removed from school. Medical oversight had been interrupted. And the parent of record was unreachable. By February 2nd, the tone of internal communications shifted decisively. What had begun as a concern became something closer to panic. Language used in official correspondence hardened. Words like oversight and coordination were replaced with withdrawal and obstruction. Behind the scenes, attempts were made to determine whether this was a temporary lapse or something more deliberate. But as hours passed, the absence of explanation began to look intentional. There was no emergency cited, no illness reported, no security threat disclosed. There was simply silence. Inside Windsor, briefings began circulating among senior officials. The question was no longer where the children were. It was why so many systems had been deliberately cut off at once. Education, health, legal communication. Each strand alone might be dismissed. Together, they formed a pattern that could not be ignored. A palace source later summarized the mood with chilling simplicity. This was not negligence. This was preparation. By the time Princess Anne was informed, the issue had already moved beyond diplomacy. It was no longer a matter of parental discretion. It was a question of whether two children had been placed into an intentional void. And once that possibility exists, royal protocol leaves no room for delay. The next step would not involve conversation. It would involve documentation. The emergency meeting was not scheduled through ordinary channels. There was no advance notice. No briefing memo circulated ahead of time. Senior aides were instructed to clear the room at Windsor Castle within minutes. Phones were removed. Assistants were dismissed. What followed was not a discussion. It was a presentation. Princess Anne entered carrying a red folder. Those who were present would later describe the moment as instantly sobering. The folder was thick, sealed, and marked with language rarely used outside the most severe constitutional circumstances. Immediate custodial breach, maternal withdrawal, no ambiguity, no soft phrasing. She placed it on the table in front of the king and did not sit down. The message was delivered plainly. The family had endured years of public pressure, reputational conflict, and private disagreement. But what had been uncovered now crossed a line that could not be managed through patience or restraint. This was no longer about image, media, narratives, or personal grievance. It was about two children being left in legal and emotional limbo. Inside the folder were documents compiled over several days by multiple departments working independently, then verified together. Education records, medical notices, legal correspondence. Each section alone raised concern. Together, they painted a picture that stunned everyone in the room. The first set of papers detailed the school withdrawals. They confirmed what had already triggered alarms in California. The children had been removed without formal notice. No transfer destination had been provided. No alternative education plan had been submitted. Even more troubling, written instructions from Meghan Markle's legal team had been sent to multiple institutions, explicitly blocking further communication with royal education liaison. The second section addressed medical care. Routine pediatric appointments for both children had been cancelled abruptly, not delayed, not rescheduled, cancelled entirely. There were no follow-up providers listed, no continuity referrals, no emergency explanation. In safeguarding terms, this was considered a serious interruption of duty of care. But it was the financial documentation that shifted the mood from concern to shock. A long-established education trust fund valued at $6.3 million and originally created to support the children's future schooling in the United Kingdom had been dissolved. The paperwork was complete. The funds had been redirected. There was no indication that alternative provisions had been established. For seasoned palace advisors, this raised a question that could not be ignored. Why dismantle a child's educational future while simultaneously removing them from school? The answer, when it came, was far more disturbing. The final document in the folder was an intelligence memo dated January 29. It was marked privileged and confidential and prepared by the Royal Intelligence Advisory Group. Unlike the other materials, this one did not catalogue actions. It outlined intent. According to the assessment, Meghan Markle had spent the previous 4 months preparing for what analysts described as complete maternal disengagement. The memo did not rely on speculation. It cited contracts, correspondence, and strategic planning documents. Among the findings was a non-disclosure agreement with a Dubai-based media financier. The agreement requested the removal of all past family associations ahead of a planned solo brand launch. Language within the document emphasized personal reinvention and narrative separation. There were also internal communications declining participation in Prince Harry's proposed joint custody framework. Drafts showed a deliberate refusal to commit to co-parenting structures beyond the bare minimum required by court order. Perhaps most telling were internal contracts linked to Arkwell operations. These documents instructed all references to Archie and Libet to be removed from future Spotify and Netflix materials by mid-2026. Their names, their images, their presence. To those in the room, the implication was unmistakable. This was not a mother stepping back temporarily. This was a systematic effort to erase the children from both public and institutional identity while retaining full personal autonomy. One legal advisor summarized the conclusion with chilling precision. This is not co-parenting. This is erasure. At that moment, the discussion ended. Princess Anne did not ask for opinions. She did not invite debate. She authorized immediate escalation. Duchess Sophie of Edinburgh was instructed to activate emergency custodial safeguard procedures without delay. A formal case documenting alleged maternal disengagement was opened on the spot. The file was prepared for submission to both the Royal Chancery Court and the California Family Court under shared jurisdiction protocols. Parallel legal action would begin simultaneously, ensuring no delay could be exploited. When Prince William arrived shortly afterward, he was handed the same red folder. Witnesses later recalled that he read in silence page after page. No interruption, no visible reaction. When he reached the final document, he looked up and spoke only once. This is no longer about her. It is about protecting two children emotionally, legally, and historically. That statement would define everything that followed. Because from that moment on, the Crown was no longer reacting to events. It was preparing to intervene. Once the red folder was closed, the atmosphere inside Windsor shifted. This was no longer a matter of interpretation. The documents had already answered the most critical question confronting the Crown. The issue was not whether Meghan Markle had stepped back from active parenting. It was whether she had been preparing to exit entirely, leaving behind not only responsibility, but history. Senior advisors began using a phrase that carried extraordinary weight within royal systems: intent. In safeguarding cases, intent matters more than optics. Accidents can be managed, oversights can be corrected, but deliberate disengagement, especially when paired with strategic planning, demands intervention. The intelligence memo dated January 29 became the centerpiece of the discussion. Unlike legal filings or welfare reports, it did not describe isolated acts. It mapped a sequence. Over a period of months, analysts observed a steady pattern of withdrawal that followed a clear internal logic. First came the quiet reduction of public references to the children. Mentions and external communications declined. Family-oriented branding softened, then vanished. The shift was subtle enough to avoid scrutiny, yet consistent enough to register within monitoring systems. Next came contractual restructuring. Correspondence revealed negotiations with a Dubai-based media financier focused on launching a personal brand independent of any family narrative. Draft agreements emphasized autonomy, reinvention, and separation from previous associations. One clause flagged by advisors requested the removal of all historical identifiers that could tie future projects to royal lineage. That alone raised concern, but what followed confirmed intent. In internal emails, Meghan Markle declined participation in Prince Harry's proposed joint custody framework. The refusal was not emotional. It was procedural. Language centered on minimizing obligations, limiting coordination, and avoiding long-term co-parenting commitments beyond what was strictly enforceable. To royal legal experts, this suggested preparation for distance, not cooperation. At the same time, Archewell-related documents revealed a coordinated effort to remove Archie and Lilet from future media materials. Instructions were issued to ensure their names and likenesses would not appear in forthcoming Spotify or Netflix content after mid-2026. No replacement narrative was offered. No transitional messaging was proposed. It was as if the children were being phased out. What unsettled advisors most was not the ambition behind these moves. It was the timing. These preparations coincided precisely with the dismantling of educational and medical structures that had anchored the children's daily lives. Education withdrawn, healthcare interrupted, identity removed from public record. Taken together, the pattern suggested something far more serious than career realignment. It suggested exit. One palace official later described the realization as a moment of collective clarity. The Crown was not watching a custody dispute. It was witnessing the early stages of abandonment carried out quietly and methodically. The language used in internal briefings became sharper. Maternal disengagement, identity displacement, emotional severance. At that stage, royal protocol dictates escalation. Princess and authorized Duchess Sophie of Edinburgh to activate emergency custodial safeguard procedures. This mechanism exists for precisely one purpose: to intervene when a royal child's continuity is at risk due to the actions or inactions of a guardian. The decision was not framed as punishment. It was framed as containment. A formal case file was opened immediately documenting all evidence of withdrawal, obstruction, and preparatory disengagement. The file was structured to withstand scrutiny under both United Kingdom and California family law standards. Parallel jurisdiction would ensure no delay, no loophole, and no ambiguity. Time mattered. Within hours, the Royal Chancery Court was notified. So too was the California Family Court assigned to oversee the children's welfare. Both were informed that the Crown was prepared to invoke emergency authority if conditions worsened. Meanwhile, Prince Harry remained largely outside these deliberations. Sources indicate that he was informed only after the framework had been set. His position, while emotionally significant, had become legally secondary. Advisors noted unresolved residency issues, financial instability, and the absence of independent infrastructure capable of supporting full guardianship. For the Crown, the calculation was stark. 2 children could not remain suspended between disengagement on one side and uncertainty on the other. They required structure. They required certainty. They required protection that did not depend on goodwill. When Prince William arrived and reviewed the intelligence memo in full, the discussion narrowed to a single question. How far was the Crown prepared to go? The answer came quickly. This was not about managing public fallout. It was not about controlling narrative. It was about preserving identity. The children were not assets. They were not symbols. They were individuals born into an institution that carries obligations as much as privilege. One advisor put it plainly: if the Crown failed to act now, it would be complicit in their erasure. That assessment removed hesitation. From that moment forward, planning shifted from review to execution. Legal mechanisms long dormant were dusted off. Historical precedents were re-examined. Emergency clauses drafted decades earlier were brought back into circulation. The Crown was preparing to do something it had avoided for generations: assume direct responsibility. And when that decision was finalized, there would be no partial measures. There would be no negotiation. There would be action. The turning point came without ceremony. There was no announcement, no public debate, and no attempt to soften the implications. Once the evidence of deliberate disengagement had been established, the machinery of the Crown began to move with quiet precision. Prince William returned to Windsor under conditions that insiders later described as urgent and non-negotiable. An emergency session of the Royal Advisory Council was convened behind closed doors. Attendance was limited to senior constitutional advisors, child welfare specialists, and members of the Privy Council authorized under emergency protocol. This was not a forum for discussion. It was a forum for decision. The central question placed before the Council was stark. Were Archie and Libet facing a level of displacement that justified direct royal intervention? The evidence was reviewed one final time. Educational withdrawal without continuity. Medical oversight interrupted. Financial safeguards dismantled. Strategic plans prepared to remove the children from both institutional and public identity. A parent unreachable. A secondary guardian unable to provide stability. There was no dissent. The Council reached unanimous agreement that the threshold had been crossed. At that moment, Prince William invoked a provision that had remained dormant since the abdication crisis of Edward VII. Known internally as Appendix 4 of the Royal Succession Stabilization Act, the clause permits the Crown to assume guardianship when royal minors face identity displacement, legal abandonment, or emotional harm arising from custodial failure. The invocation carried extraordinary weight. It was not symbolic. It was operational. Within hours, protective measures were enacted across multiple jurisdictions. The children's passports were placed under immediate security restriction, preventing any international movement without dual authorization from Princess Anne and the Crown's Child Welfare Council. This was not framed as confinement. It was framed as containment, ensuring the children could not be relocated beyond reach while legal proceedings were underway. Simultaneously, an image protection order was issued under the Windsor Privacy Act for a period of 5 years. Any commercial or promotional use of the children's names, likenesses, or narratives was prohibited without explicit Crown approval. Streaming platforms, publishers, and licensing partners were notified through legal channels. The message was unmistakable. The children were not commodities. Then came the financial response. Prince William authorized the creation of a Royal Restoration Fund valued at £12 million. Its purpose was not public relations. It was recovery. The fund was dedicated to emotional stabilization, educational continuity, and long-term reintegration within a protected environment. Therapists specializing in cross-cultural identity trauma were retained. Educational planners were tasked with rebuilding structure without disruption. This was not a temporary arrangement. It was a long view. As these measures unfolded, Prince Harry submitted a request for temporary custodial authority. According to multiple sources, the request was reviewed and declined within hours. The reasoning was procedural, not personal. Unresolved residency issues, travel limitations, insufficient independent resources to meet safeguarding standards. The decision was communicated without commentary. Custody, guardianship, and protection of Windsor children now fell solely under Crown protocol. By nightfall, the operation was complete. Systems were locked. Orders were filed. External partners were notified. No leaks occurred. No press briefings followed. The absence of spectacle was intentional. For the monarchy, this was not about asserting dominance. It was about fulfilling duty. One senior advisor later summarized the moment with quiet gravity. The Crown did not take the children away. It stepped in because no one else could be trusted to hold the line. Yet, even as control was established, those inside Windsor understood that this was not the end of the crisis. It was the beginning of its most volatile phase because while the Crown had acted with authority, one figure remained entirely outside the new order. Meghan Markle had not responded, and the silence that followed would soon speak louder than any challenge ever could. While Windsor moved with discipline and restraint, Meghan Markle moved in the opposite direction, or rather, she did not move at all. In the hours following the Crown's intervention, requests for clarification were sent through formal legal channels. They were acknowledged, then left unanswered. Statements were drafted, revised, and ultimately withheld. What emerged instead was silence, deliberate, and absolute. For palace officials, this absence of response was more revealing than any public denial. As legal orders took effect, consequences began unfolding beyond the walls of Windsor. International partners were notified of the Image Protection Directive. Streaming platforms quietly updated internal compliance notices. References to the children were removed from archive descriptions, promotional materials, and future development outlines. No announcement explained the changes. The names simply vanished. Behind the scenes, financial regulators in multiple jurisdictions initiated precautionary freezes on accounts linked to holding structures associated with Meghan Markle's media ventures. The actions were not punitive. They were protective, triggered by unresolved custodial authority and potential misuse of minors' identities. Sponsorship negotiations tied to family-oriented storytelling projects stalled, then collapsed entirely. What had once been framed as reinvention now looked like isolation. Reports soon surfaced, placing Meghan aboard a luxury yacht in Doha, photographed in the company of a Middle Eastern media investor. To the outside world, the images suggested confidence and freedom. To those monitoring the situation, they confirmed distance, not just geographic, but emotional. No inquiries were made about the children's location. No formal objections were filed against the guardianship measures. No appeal was submitted within the critical early window when influence might still have mattered. Inside royal briefings, the contrast was noted with unease. While systems were mobilized to stabilize two young lives, the primary parent of record remained unreachable. Prince Harry, by contrast, was very much present. According to sources within his circle, he was stunned by the speed and finality of the Crown's actions. He had believed that custody agreements, once signed, offered protection. He had believed that compromise would be enough. He was wrong. When he requested temporary custodial authority, the response was swift and clinical. His residency status in the United States remained unresolved. Travel limitations complicated jurisdictional oversight. Financial instability raised safeguarding concerns. None of these factors were moral judgments. They were procedural barriers. The message delivered to him was precise and unemotional. Guardianship required structure. Structure required capacity. At that moment, he did not meet the threshold. The letter conveying the decision was delivered by royal courier. It contained no commentary, no reassurance, and no apology. Custody, guardianship, and protection of Windsor children would remain solely under Crown protocol until further notice. Any future access would be conditional, supervised, and subject to review. For Prince Harry, it marked a devastating realization. He was no longer the decision-maker. He was an observer. As these developments unfolded, another shift occurred quietly within the palace. Responsibility for the children's daily emotional welfare was reassigned. Princess Catherine stepped into a role that required no announcement. She adjusted her schedule. Specialists were retained. A trusted caregiver with deep experience in cross-cultural identity challenges was reassigned to support Lyot directly. The approach was careful and understated. There were no staged moments, no performative gestures. Stability was restored through routine, not spectacle. One small moment, however, carried profound symbolism. A single photograph was released to the press without caption or explanation. It showed Lilith walking out of Windsor Chapel holding Princess Charlotte's hand. No commentary followed. None was needed. To the public, it appeared gentle. To those who understood the context, it was decisive. The children were no longer adrift. They were anchored. As for Meghan Markle, her legal team eventually issued a brief statement citing privacy concerns and ongoing proceedings. It contained no reference to the children's well-being, no reassurance, no acknowledgement of the measures taken in their name. Within Windsor, the reaction was subdued, but resolute. Silence when paired with abandonment is not neutrality. It is confirmation. And with that confirmation, the Crown prepared for the next phase. Because guardianship had been secured, but judgment had not yet been delivered. While legal mechanisms tightened and authority consolidated, something else unfolded inside the palace, far from courtrooms and sealed orders. It was quieter, slower, and far more consequential. The Crown understood that guardianship alone could not repair what had been disrupted. Protection without belonging is only containment. What the children needed now was not just safety, but continuity, a sense that their lives had not been reduced to legal filings or institutional concern. That responsibility fell deliberately and carefully to the next generation. Within days of the guardianship transition, Princess Anne authorized a series of understated measures designed to restore emotional stability. No press releases announced them. No schedules were leaked. Each step was taken as if it were routine, even though nothing about the moment was ordinary. Light was introduced into a structured daily rhythm inside Windsor. Lessons resumed quietly. Play was reintroduced without agenda. Familiar routines replaced uncertainty. The emphasis was not on discipline, but on reassurance. Princess Catherine oversaw the process personally. Her involvement was not symbolic. She coordinated with child psychologists experienced in identity disruption and displacement. She insisted on consistency over intensity, normally over narrative. The goal was not to explain the crisis to a child, but to remove the sense that life itself had become unstable. Those closest to the process described Catherine's approach as deliberate restraint, no dramatics, no forced bonding, just presence. And then came Princess Charlotte. The decision to involve her was not impulsive. It was discussed carefully among senior advisors and child welfare specialists. Charlotte was not asked to perform. She was not instructed to represent anything. She was simply encouraged to be what she already was, family. The two girls were introduced gradually through shared routines rather than formal meetings, meals, walks, quiet moments where conversation was optional. No cameras, no expectations. What emerged was natural. Charlotte, already accustomed to the rhythms of royal life, became a point of calm, not through authority, but through familiarity. There was no hierarchy imposed, no explanation demanded, just companionship. One palace aide later observed that this was the most important phase of the entire operation. Legal authority could be imposed in an instant. Emotional trust could not. As days passed, the change was visible. Lila's anxiety eased. Her sleep patterns stabilized. Her drawings, once described as fragmented and unsettled, softened in tone. These details were recorded quietly by professionals, not shared publicly. Inside Windsor, there was a growing sense that something fragile had been caught before it shattered. That understanding shaped the next move. On the morning of Candlemas Eve, Kensington Palace released a single photograph to the press. There was no statement attached, no caption, no explanation. It showed Lilith and Princess Charlotte walking out of Windsor Chapel together, hand in hand. To casual observers, it was a gentle image. To those watching closely, it carried unmistakable meaning. Continuity had been restored. The message was not about triumph or vindication. It was about inheritance in its truest sense. Not titles, not wealth, but belonging. Inside the palace, advisors noted the precision of the timing. The photograph appeared just as legal filings intensified across jurisdictions, just as speculation reached its peak, just as the narrative threatened to spiral beyond control. The Crown did not counter speculation with words. It countered it with reality. Two children grounded in family, one future protected quietly. And in that moment, it became clear that the crisis had shifted. This was no longer a story about Meghan Markle's choices. It was a story about what happens when an institution decides that children are not collateral. They are the line itself. The next phase would not be shaped by emotion. It would be shaped by judgment. The ruling did not arrive with spectacle. There was no dramatic courtroom scene, no raised voices, no last-minute appeals. When judgment finally came, it unfolded the way the Crown prefers its most consequential acts to unfold: quietly, formally, irreversibly. On the morning of February 1st, the court convened under conditions of exceptional restraint. Proceedings were brief. Arguments were limited. Evidence already extensive was accepted without contest. Meghan Markle was not present. Her legal team confirmed that she would no longer participate in the hearing. That absence spoke louder than any defense. The decision that followed was historic. Meghan Markle was formally stripped of all custodial authority over Archie and Lilet. The judgment cited sustained disengagement, obstruction of welfare oversight, and deliberate severance of educational and medical continuity. In legal terms, it was described as abandonment through omission rather than action. Within hours, Princess Anne addressed the matter in a rare live statement from St. James's Palace. Her words were measured, but unmistakable. Any formal influence Meghan Markle may claim over Windsor children is hereby null and void. The Crown no longer recognizes any maternal privileges previously granted. The welfare of these children must reflect duty, not ambition. There was no rebuttal from across the Atlantic. What followed was a cascade of institutional consequences. Trust structures previously established outside royal oversight were frozen and dismantled. Financial vehicles tied to the children's names were declared invalid under the Windsor Accords. Commercial agreements referencing Archie or Lilet were terminated without exception. The children's identities were placed under full royal protection, shielded from licensing, branding, or monetization of any kind. Then came the most decisive measure of all. By formal directive of Prince William, issued under a sovereign guardianship mechanism last used during the abdication crisis of the 1930s. Both children's passports were placed into permanent royal security custody. Until reaching adulthood, they would not leave the United Kingdom without direct authorization from the Crown. This was not framed as restriction. It was framed as preservation. At the same time, a classified operation quietly moved into effect. Coordinated through the Foreign Office and Child Welfare authorities, a small team was dispatched to California. Their mandate was precise. Document conditions, ensure compliance, secure all remaining legal ties, if necessary, extract. The operation carried an internal name that revealed its intent: Dandelion. Resilient, rooted, impossible to erase once established. As this unfolded, Meghan Markle was photographed in Doha attending private gatherings with media financiers. Images circulated briefly, then faded. Her legal representatives issued a short statement disputing jurisdiction and asserting privacy. It contained no reference to the children, no challenge to the ruling, no promise of return. Within royal circles, the silence was understood. Meanwhile, those once considered allies began to distance themselves. High-profile supporters demanded explanations that never came. Planned projects stalled. A proposed podcast relaunch was quietly withdrawn after focus groups described it as emotionally detached and inauthentic. The narrative Meghan Markle had hoped to rebuild collapsed under its own absence. Prince Harry, for his part, withdrew from public view. Appearances were cancelled. Invitations declined. Those close to him described a man caught between shock and regret, struggling to comprehend how quickly authority had moved beyond his reach. And yet the Crown did not frame this as punishment. In a clarification issued by the Privy Council, it was stated plainly, the monarchy is not correcting people. It is correcting course. Responsibility for Archie and Lilet now rests with Princess Anne, Prince William, Princess Catherine, and Prince Edward as named trustees. Their mandate is singular: protection, stability, continuity. Inside Windsor, life resumed. Lessons continued. Meals were shared. Gardens were walked. The extraordinary was folded gently into routine. There were no victory statements, no declarations of triumph, only structure, only care. Only the quiet assertion that children born into history will not be abandoned to convenience. One question, however, remained unresolved. Why did Prince Harry speak out with shocking accusations only after custody had already been lost? Why did claims involving Meghan Markle and Prince Andrew surface only when authority slipped away? Those answers have not yet emerged. And until they do, this story is not finished. Because the Crown has acted, the children are protected. But the truth behind the final rupture has yet to be